lady in the middle there.
I'm Inga from Research Europe. I agree with everything that's been said so far, including the fact that there's not enough competent journalists in Brussels, and also that the public generally is often not that interested. But would you also say that Europe or the EU in itself has a bit of a problem in communicating what it actually does? Because when you look at, for example, the European Commission, the press briefings they put out are extremely complicated. They're written in a very, very elaborate style. They use a lot of complicated insider terms, and they're very, very puffy, unfortunately. So I think a lot of journalists, with the time constraints that they have, just cannot go into the depths that they would like to go because they themselves have difficulties understanding what the Commission in particular, but also other EU bodies are actually trying to say.
Have we got any comments?
Well, I'd personally be very surprised if most journalists, when they saw a piece of paper come through with the EU flag on it, and just go, because it's never going to be interesting.
From I'm a European correspondent, so I have seen them through, but I enjoy very much looking at these things. But I find it very difficult sometimes to understand what's actually going on. And I do make calls to the press office then, and sometimes find that the press office cannot explain to me what their statement is actually trying to say. So I think they just have to work on the way they communicate with the press.
No, I mean I agree with that. I think it's just a jargon. It's painful sometimes when you see a press release talking about an celebrated interinstitutional agreement on the multi-annual framework. Not that there's been press release on that, because I don't think it's possible yet to set up on this picture. But anyway, it's not something that will excite people. If you say if you use different language, you'll massively improve the EU's own communication methods and effectiveness. But I will say this though, just to return to my previous point, the EU and the Commission, and MEPs for that matter, would make themselves a huge favour by doing less, by doing a lot less, because then it will be much easier for them to communicate the things that really, really matter. And when you do something meaningful, people will notice it. When you do something that will have an impact, people do notice it. For example, on roaming charges. That was picked up everywhere. Because it was an easy thing, because it was something that impacted on people. When you talk about all these various statements on things from heaven to earth, people would just stop paying attention to you. So if there are any Commission communication officials in here, just do less. Just do less and do better. Simple.
Antonia, the head of media.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to reply to that a bit. As I said, I'm head of media here, and I have been a spokesperson in Brussels, dealing with Inga. And I'd say yes, we don't do ourselves any favours. Sometimes, particularly when we're here on the ground, not dealing with the journalists who know what an institutional agreement on a multinational programme, multi-annual programme is, but people who are, just writing what they're writing. Sometimes it's very frustrating for us that we can't say, no, actually the Commission isn't trying to stop you selling crackers to under 25-year-olds. Because there's so many, as Clive said earlier, there's so many bits of the Commission that could be involved that nobody wants to say no in case. So I think you've got a very fair point. And I don't think anyone's trying to say that we're perfect. We've got a lot to learn. And there's a lot to be changed. And I think Matt's point about we should be doing less, in a perfect world, I think even those of us doing communication in the Commission know that we should be doing less. But you try telling a commissioner they can't do a press conference on this thing that their services have been working for. And in DG Research, which you know very well, the amount of times I had to say to people, okay, you've been working on this conference for 2 years, but nobody cares. Nobody wants to know about it except the people who are there. So it's not easy, and it's a very fair point, and I would agree with Matt as well.
And to be fair to the Commission, it's not only the Commission itself, it's also MEPs, including the individual groups. Just the number of press releases you get on pointless things from MEPs. I mean, we generally care about these things, but I think we're 1 in a million people that
Alright, next one. Yes.
I mean, to me, one of the key things that this comes back to, and I realise this, I work for Friends of the Earth, and when I started working for an environmental group, you realise that there's a very big difference between news and information. And that's one of the key things. And the problem is, the more complex the information is, the more difficult it is to get news. And information is often communicated with news. So you might not just hear Nick Clegg and Ed Miliband argued about something. You might have some information about what it is. But the question is how much information is communicated, particularly if it's something complex. And I think on EU, the information tends to be very limited. Even in a non-Eurosceptic report, it would be the European Parliament voted for this on GM. So what was that? Was that the committee? Was that the end of the process? What's going on? And you just don't know. And it also, in the context, UK has lots of regulations of our own, and we're also bound by some astoundingly strict regulations coming from the World Trade Organization. When was the last time you saw any discussion of the way in which we can't ban the import of lots of things? Because the WTO, the US would take us to court through the WTO. There's a lot of other processes out there. And then obviously on the news is whether it's got a true basis in reality, which is one of the problems we have. But it's not the only problem we have. It is the fact that the information doesn't come across. And I think most people, I can explain the basics of EU regulation in around 1 minute, but most newspapers won't do that. And you won't go to the Guardian website and be able to find it.
I'll also just quickly, going back to the previous question as well. We've got the head of media for the Commission in here in the UK. We think we've also got the head of media for the European Parliament in the UK in here. And you've got these people knocking around in every country. You've probably got somebody from the European Council as well, and God knows what. And there's the old Kissinger thing, who do I call when I want to speak to Europe? And that's the same thing, the journalists have got the problem. Why can't the EU set up one hub for its media, where you can just spread everything out? You phone up this number, and somebody goes, oh right, this is such and such, and you send it to the right person. Because what happens is you phone up and you ask somebody in the Commission, okay, what's all this about? And they don't know, but they don't know who does. So you phone somebody in the European Parliament and say, well, do you know what's going on? They don't know. You try and get hold of somebody in the Council, they don't know either. And you go, right, solid, and you believe the UK press release instead. And that's sort of, so getting the hold of this information is very, very hard.
Any there?
Yes. I'm Jack Thurston. I run a couple of projects about finding out how Europe spends its money on farm subsidies and fisheries subsidies. I wanted to ask the panel if they agree with me that while there are faults amongst in the editorial process in newsrooms, people like Bruno and his ilk do know their stuff and are able to cover it and are able to find out what's relevant. It's not that it's too complex at all. That's a red herring. But would they agree that the reason why I think we get the outcomes from the press that we do is for two reasons. The first is what I call as the nationalistic tendency that national governments, who are much more powerful at influencing news agendas, treat the EU as something that they go to get victories for themselves, or when something goes wrong, they can blame. So national governments either beat up on the EU and win, or go to Brussels and lose and then blame the EU for whatever has happened. So both times the EU loses. And then there's this sort of federalist tendency, which is that people in the Brussels institutions feel impotent to have power because ultimately power is vested in national governments and public governments. And they try to accrue more power to themselves, and they think if only we had a little bit more power, we would be able to improve people's lives. And I see this in any kind of political institution. People just want more power because if they were just in the cabinet, then they could really do something. If there's no good being in the cabinet, I need to be in Downing Street. There's this desire to accrue more powers, and what the failure of the national governments is to understand intergovernmentalism and how to present that in a sophisticated way. And so they want to hamper the EU, make the EU. And the reason why the EU doesn't have one person to call is because the national governments decided they didn't want that to be the case. Not because the EU chose to have 3 heads. It's because national governments thought it would be convenient for them to have this anonymous guy. And then for the federal tendency, the failure is to understand that political institutions need to earn the right to govern. They don't just win power somehow with some blueprint, that they have to do small things that get people's trust.